For 35 years, folks in Perry County thought Nettie Sloan was gone. In 1958, 20 lawmen sealed off her hollow, accused her husband of running a still that never existed.
The granny who vanished for 35 years was found on a mountain after poisoning 20 lawmen who starved her family. For 35 years, she was nothing but a legend that lawmen whispered about. Before meals, they suddenly found difficult to swallow. A story that deputies told to explain why certain foods should never be accepted from strangers in the mountains. They called her the Poison Widow of Pine Mountain, a ghost who had killed 20 men without leaving a mark on any of them, who had vanished so completely that the federal government spent decades searching for a phantom that seemed to exist only in the nightmares of those who had survived her hospitality. But the Poison Widow was not supernatural. She was a woman named Delilah May Combs, 72 years old when she began her campaign, and 107 when they finally found her, still alive, still watching from a cabin on a ridge that no one had thought to search. This is the true story of the oldest killer in Appalachian history. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Leslie County, Kentucky, in the heart of the Eastern Highlands, during the desperate years of the Great Depression, when starvation was not a metaphor, but a daily reality for families whose resources had been systematically destroyed by men with badges. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before the Revolutionary War, who measured wealth not in currency, but in the ability to feed children through winters that showed no mercy to the unprepared. You see, in Leslie County during the years of our story, the coal companies and the government they controlled had developed methods for breaking families that did not require bullets or arrests. They had discovered that starvation was more effective than violence, that a family whose food supplies had been confiscated would eventually surrender to whatever demands the companies made. The process was legal, under statutes that the companies had written and that company judges enforced, a system of theft that called itself taxation, and that left children with bellies swollen from hunger while officials congratulated themselves on maintaining order. The woman at the center of our story was born Delilah May Combs in 1865, 3 months before the end of the Civil War, in a cabin that overlooked the hollow where her family had lived since 1802. She had married Ezekiel Fugate when she was 16, had borne him 9 children of whom 5 had survived to adulthood, had buried a husband and 4 children, and still continued living because stopping was not something her nature permitted. That's right. Delilah Fugate, known throughout the region as Granny Fugate, had seen more death by her 70th year than most people encountered in entire lifetimes. She had watched the world change around her through decades that had brought electricity to cities that seemed as distant as foreign countries, had maintained traditions that her grandmother had taught her and that she had taught to her own children and grandchildren. She was a repository of knowledge that the modern world was forgetting, a living connection to a past that most people believed had disappeared. Granny Fugate stood 5 feet 2 inches tall, had hair that had turned white before her 40th birthday, possessed eyes that were the pale blue of winter sky, and that seemed to see things that others missed. Her body was bent from 7 decades of mountain labor. Her hands were gnarled from work that had never ended, but her mind remained sharp in ways that exceeded what her appearance might have suggested. She knew every plant that grew on Pine Mountain, knew which ones healed and which ones killed, had accumulated knowledge that her ancestors had developed over centuries of living in these hills. In 1937, Granny Fugate presided over a family that included 3 surviving children, 11 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren who were too young to work but old enough to require food that the family struggled to provide. The household occupied a property that had been in Fugate hands since 1805, worked land that generations had cleared and improved, maintained a subsistence that required every member's contribution, but that had sustained the family through difficulties that would have destroyed those with less determination. The trouble that would transform this elderly woman into a mass murderer began with the appointment of a new county tax assessor named Vernon Crawford, whose mandate from the coal company that had arranged his appointment was to break families whose independence interfered with company interests. The Fugate property sat on land that the company wanted, contained timber that the company coveted, occupied a hollow that the company intended to use for purposes that required the current occupants to be removed. Crawford had developed techniques for accomplishing removal that did not require the violence that might attract attention from authorities who still occasionally cared about legality. He would assess properties at values that exceeded any reasonable estimate, would present tax bills that families could not possibly pay, would then seize property and food supplies as payment for debts that his own fraudulent assessments had created. The process was legal under statutes that the company had ensured were written to permit exactly this kind of theft. The Fugate family was assessed a tax bill in the spring of 1937 that exceeded the value of everything they owned. The assessment claimed that the property, which had been valued at $300 the previous year, was now worth $15,000 and owed taxes accordingly. The bill was absurd, was designed to be impossible to pay, was the opening move in a process that would end with the family's destruction. Granny Fugate traveled to the county seat to protest the assessment, brought documentation showing that the valuation was fraudulent, demanded that the bill be corrected to reflect actual values that the property possessed. Crawford received her with the courtesy that his position required, but with an indifference to her arguments that showed the outcome had already been determined. "The assessment stands," Crawford told her, his voice carrying the patience of a man explaining obvious truths to a child. "If you cannot pay the taxes owed, the county will be forced to seize property to satisfy the debt. I suggest you find the money, or prepare to vacate the land your family has occupied." "We have occupied this land since 1805, Granny replied, her voice steady despite the fury that was building inside her. "We have paid every tax that was legitimately owed. This assessment is theft, and you know it as well as I do." Crawford smiled with satisfaction that he did not attempt to conceal. "The law is the law, Mrs. Fugate. I don't make the rules. I simply enforce them. You have 60 days to pay what you owe. After that, we will be forced to take action." The family spent those 60 days attempting to raise money that could not be raised, to find legal remedies that did not exist, to identify any avenue that might prevent the disaster that Crawford's assessment had initiated. Every attempt failed. The lawyers they consulted declined to challenge assessments that the company-controlled courts would uphold. The banks they approached declined to provide loans that would never be repaid. The officials they petitioned declined to interfere with processes that their positions required them to support. The seizure began on June 15, 1937. Crawford arrived with 20 deputies, men whose badges provided authority that their characters did not deserve, whose willingness to execute orders exceeded any concern for the justice of what they were doing. They came with wagons to haul away property that the family had accumulated over generations, came with the confidence of men who believed their authority was absolute. They took everything. The livestock went first, the milk cow that provided dairy for children who had no other source of calcium, the chickens that provided eggs and occasional meat, the pigs that would have been slaughtered in autumn to provide protein through winter. The animals were loaded onto wagons, while children watched and cried, were driven away to auctions where Crawford's associates would purchase them for fractions of their value. The stored food went next. The jars of vegetables that women had preserved through long summer days, the smoked meat that hung in the smokehouse, the grain that had been set aside for winter, the dried beans and corn that would have sustained the family through months when nothing grew. The deputies carried it all away, emptied cellars and smokehouses and pantries, until nothing remained except bare shelves that mocked the labor that had filled them. They took the seeds that had been saved for spring planting, the tools that were necessary for farming, the equipment that generations had accumulated and maintained. They took furniture that had been built by hands long dead, took quilts that grandmothers had stitched during winter evenings, took everything that could be converted to cash, regardless of its value to the family that was losing it. When they were finished, the Fugate family possessed nothing except the clothes they wore and the cabin they occupied, and Crawford made clear that the cabin itself would be seized if additional taxes were not paid by the end of the year. The family that had sustained itself through every hardship since 1805 was left with nothing, was expected to survive through a winter that was only months away, without food or tools or any means of obtaining either. "This should motivate you to find employment in the mines," Crawford observed, as his deputies completed their work. The company is always hiring, and the wages will allow you to pay your obligations. I suggest you reconsider your family's resistance to opportunities that would benefit everyone involved. The message was clear. The starvation that the seizure would produce was designed to break the family's independence, to force them into the company mines where they would be trapped in debt bondage that would last for generations. The technique had worked on dozens of families throughout the county, had transformed independent farmers into dependent workers whose labor enriched the company while their own conditions steadily worsened. The Fugate family was not given the opportunity to surrender to the company's demands. The winter of 1937-1938 was one of the harshest in Kentucky history. The temperatures dropped below zero repeatedly. The snow accumulated to depths that made travel impossible. The conditions that might have been survivable with adequate preparation became lethal for a family that had been stripped of everything. The first weeks were a desperate scramble for anything that might provide sustenance. The family foraged for roots that the cold ground reluctantly surrendered, searched for nuts that squirrels had cached and that hungry humans could sometimes discover. They set snares for small game, though the animals that might have been caught had mostly retreated to dens where survival instincts told them to wait out the cold. What little they found was shared among 23 mouths, was divided into portions so small that they merely delayed starvation rather than preventing it. The hunger was a constant presence, a pain that began in the stomach and spread until the entire body seemed to be consuming itself. The children complained at first, cried for food that could not be provided, asked questions that adults could not answer without breaking. Eventually the children stopped complaining, stopped crying, stopped asking, not because the hunger had diminished, but because they lacked the energy that complaining required. The children died first. The youngest great-grandchildren, whose small bodies could not retain heat and whose nutritional needs could not be met, succumbed during the first weeks of deep cold. Little Sarah, who was 3 years old and who had been named after Granny Fugate's own mother, died on December 23, 1937. She went to sleep on Christmas Eve's Eve and did not wake up, her small body finally surrendering to cold and hunger that had been wearing her down since the seizure 6 months before. They buried her on Christmas Day, hacking a grave from ground so frozen that each stroke of the pickaxe sent shudders through arms that had no strength left to give. The family gathered around a hole that was smaller than any grave should be, listened to words that the cold turned to vapor before they could reach ears that were numb from more than temperature. The second child died on January 3, 1938. Michael was 4 years old, had been Sarah's constant companion, had asked repeatedly where she had gone and why she wasn't coming back. He stopped asking on January 2nd, stopped responding to his name, stopped showing awareness of anything that was happening around him. He died in his mother's arms, his eyes open but seeing nothing, his body finally releasing a spirit that had fought longer than anyone would have thought possible. The third child was Mary, who was 2 years old and who had been born during a summer that now seemed to belong to a different world entirely. She died on February 8th, her body so light when they buried her that the man who carried her to the grave said later that he had thought for a moment he was carrying an empty blanket. 3 children under the age of 5, 3 graves carved from frozen ground, 3 losses that exceeded what the family's collective grief could process. The elderly died next. Granny Fugate's oldest son, who was 57 and whose health had never recovered from decades of labor, died in January when his weakened body could no longer fight an infection that adequate nutrition would have prevented. His name was Ezekiel, named after his father, and he had worked every day of his adult life to build something that the seizure had destroyed in a single afternoon. His wife Rachel followed him 2 weeks later, her grief combining with her physical deterioration to produce a death that the family physician would have called heart failure, but that everyone understood was starvation, complicated by hopelessness. She had refused to eat during her husband's final days, had given her portions to children who needed them more, had weakened herself beyond any possibility of recovery. The grandchildren died during February, young adults whose bodies should have been strong enough to survive, but whose reserves had been depleted by months of hunger that had begun even before the worst of the cold arrived. Thomas was 22, had been planning to marry in the spring, had talked about the life he would build with a girl from the next hollow over. He died on February 15th, his plans for the future dying with him. His sister Elizabeth died 3 days later, 20 years old, and possessed of a beauty that everyone said would have made her the prettiest bride in Leslie County if she had lived long enough to marry. She died in her grandmother's arms. Her final words a request that Granny tell her mother that she was sorry she couldn't stay longer. By the time spring finally arrived, the Fugate family had buried 7 members, 3 great-grandchildren, 2 adult children, and 2 grandchildren whose bodies had failed, during the months when the snow had prevented any possibility of obtaining help. 7 graves dug into ground that had received Fugates since 1805, 7 deaths that were directly attributable to the seizure that Crawford had orchestrated, 7 absences that would echo through the family for generations. The survivors emerged from the winter as something different from what they had been before. The remaining grandchildren had watched siblings and cousins die, had experienced hunger that exceeded anything their young minds could process, had learned that the world contained cruelties that no one would prevent. They would carry that winter's scars for the rest of their lives, would never fully recover from months of watching family members weaken and die while they could do nothing to help. Granny Fugate emerged from the winter as something different from the woman who had entered it. She had watched children die because men with badges had stolen the food that would have kept them alive. She had held grandchildren whose bodies grew cold because the seizure had taken the blankets that would have kept them warm. She had presided over a winter of death that violated every understanding she had ever held about how the world was supposed to work. She did not emerge seeking justice through legal channels. She had attempted that before the seizure and had discovered that the legal system served those who controlled it. She did not emerge seeking help from authorities who might care. She had learned during the winter that no one cared, that her family's deaths would be recorded as unfortunate consequences of harsh weather rather than as murders accomplished through the theft of food and supplies. She emerged with a plan that had formed during the long nights when she had watched children die and had known that she would kill the men responsible. The plan drew on knowledge that her grandmother had taught her, knowledge that her ancestors had accumulated over centuries of living in mountains, where survival sometimes required methods that the civilized world found uncomfortable. She knew plants. She knew which ones healed fevers and which ones soothed pain, and which ones stopped hearts so gently that no physician would find evidence of anything except natural death. The knowledge had been passed from mother to daughter for generations, had been used primarily for healing, but had always included awareness that the same plants that cured could also kill. Granny Fugate had never used that knowledge for harm during her 72 years of life. She would use it now. The campaign began in the late spring of 1938, when the garden had produced the first vegetables of the season, and when Granny Fugate had gathered the plants she required from locations that only she knew. The preparation required care that her patient nature was suited to provide, attention to detail that ensured the desired effect would occur without any indication of how it had been produced. The first death occurred on May 15, 1938, exactly 11 months after the seizure that had killed 7 members of her family. A deputy named Dale Tackett was found dead in his home, the apparent victim of heart failure that his physician attributed to the strain of work and the excesses of a lifestyle that had never prioritized health. There was no suspicion of foul play, no investigation beyond the cursory examination that natural deaths received, no connection made to the elderly woman who had brought the pie that Tackett had eaten the night before his death. That's right. Granny Fugate killed her victims with hospitality that the mountain tradition made impossible to refuse. She appeared at their doors with pies and preserves and other foods that she explained were gifts from a family grateful for service that the community depended upon. She was an elderly woman, a grandmother whose appearance suggested nothing threatening, whose offerings seemed to express appreciation rather than concealment of intent that no one would have suspected. The second death came 3 weeks later, claiming Robert Lawson, another deputy who had participated in the seizure. Lawson died in circumstances that matched Tackett's death exactly. Heart failure that his physician attributed to natural causes, no indication of anything suspicious, no connection to the kindly grandmother who had brought the jar of preserves that Lawson had consumed during the days before his heart stopped beating. The pattern that would define the spring and summer of 1938 had been established. Granny Fugate would identify a target from among the men who had participated in the seizure, would prepare gifts that contained compounds whose effects would not manifest for days, would deliver those gifts with gratitude that seemed entirely genuine because it was genuine. She was genuinely grateful for the opportunity to kill men who had murdered her family through starvation. The third and fourth deaths came in June, the fifth and sixth in July, each attributed to natural causes that overworked physicians had no reason to question. The deputies were middle-aged men whose lifestyles included habits that made heart failure plausible. They were dying at a rate that was elevated, but not dramatically unusual. No one connected the deaths to each other or to the elderly woman whose visits had preceded each one. The brilliance of Granny Fugate's method was its invisibility. She was not using poisons that produced obvious symptoms, was not employing compounds that any examination would detect. She was using plants whose effects mimicked natural disease processes, whose action was gradual enough to avoid suspicion, whose presence would never be discovered because no one would think to look for them. The 7th through 10th deaths came during the late summer, taking deputies whose health had seemed robust and whose deaths shocked families who had expected them to live for decades longer. The deaths were attributed to various causes: heart failure, stroke, sudden infection, but all shared the common factor of occurring within days of receiving gifts from the elderly woman whose gratitude for their service seemed so genuine. By autumn, the surviving deputies had begun to notice the pattern. 10 of their colleagues had died over 6 months, all of natural causes, all preceded by visits from members of the community, expressing appreciation for service rendered. The coincidence was troubling, suggested connections that rational minds found difficult to accept, but that instinct warned should not be ignored. Suspicion began to focus on Granny Fugate after the 10th death, when a deputy's wife mentioned that her husband had received a gift from the elderly woman just days before his heart stopped. The comment prompted others to recall similar gifts, similar visits, similar expressions of gratitude that had preceded deaths that no one had thought to connect. Crawford ordered that no deputy accept food from anyone outside their immediate families, that any gifts received be reported and examined before consumption. The order was sensible, represented exactly the precaution that might have saved lives if it had been implemented earlier. But the order came too late for men who had already consumed what Granny Fugate had provided, whose bodies already contained compounds that were working toward effects that could not be prevented. The 11th and 12th deaths occurred despite the precautions, taking deputies who had received gifts before the order was issued, whose consumption of those gifts was already producing effects that manifested days later. The deaths confirmed the suspicions that had developed, demonstrated that the elderly woman who seemed so harmless was killing men with precision that exceeded what anyone would have believed possible. Crawford organized an operation to arrest Granny Fugate on November 15, 1938, led a force of deputies to the Fugate property, expecting to find the elderly woman who had killed so many of their colleagues. They found the property deserted, the cabin empty, no sign of the woman they sought or any indication of where she might have gone. Granny Fugate had anticipated exactly this response. She had prepared her disappearance throughout the months of her campaign, had established a refuge that no search would discover, had accumulated supplies that would sustain her through years of isolation that she fully intended would span the rest of her existence, however long that existence might prove to be. The remaining deputies died over the following months, victims of gifts they had consumed before suspicion had developed, their deaths occurring according to schedules that Granny Fugate had calculated, but that the recipients could not predict. The 13th and 14th deaths came in December, the 15th and 16th in January, each one confirming the effectiveness of methods that had been employed months before. The 17th through 19th deaths occurred during the spring of 1939, taking deputies who had believed themselves safe because they had not received gifts during the months when suspicion was high. They had not realized that the gifts they had accepted earlier, during the innocent period when the elderly woman's visits had seemed entirely benign, contained compounds whose effects were delayed by design rather than by accident. Crawford himself was the 20th and final victim, dying in April of 1939 from what his physician diagnosed as heart failure, but what everyone in the county understood was the culmination of a campaign that had eliminated every man who had participated in the seizure that had killed the Fugate family members. The assessor who had orchestrated the theft that had produced 7 deaths had himself become a victim of consequences that his power could not prevent. 20 deputies, every man who had participated in the seizure that had starved 7 members of the Fugate family to death, all of them killed by an elderly woman whose hospitality had concealed the most effective murder campaign in Appalachian history. All of them dead from natural causes that no investigation could attribute to anything except the unfortunate coincidence of unhealthy lifestyles and demanding work. The investigation that followed was the most intensive in Kentucky history to that point, but it produced nothing that could be used to prosecute anyone. The deaths had all been certified as natural by physicians whose examinations had found nothing suspicious. The circumstantial connections to Granny Fugate were suggestive, but could not prove anything that a court would accept. The case remained open but inactive, a mystery that investigators could not solve because the solution exceeded what their understanding of crime permitted. Granny Fugate had vanished into the mountains that had always been her home, and she did not emerge for 35 years. The wilderness of eastern Kentucky became her sanctuary, terrain that she knew better than any map could document, that concealed her through decades of solitude that would have destroyed anyone with less determination. At 73 years old when her campaign concluded, she was older than most people ever lived, was expected by everyone who knew of her existence to die within months of her disappearance into wilderness that should have been fatal for someone of her age. They underestimated her. The knowledge that had allowed her to kill 20 men was the same knowledge that allowed her to survive alone in mountains that would have defeated people half her age with twice her resources. She knew which plants provided nutrition and which provided medicine. She knew how to find shelter that the weather could not penetrate. She knew techniques for survival that her grandmother had taught her, and that she had never expected to need, but that circumstances now required. She found a location that no search would discover, a shelf of rock high on Pine Mountain that was accessible only by routes that required knowledge she possessed, and that no outsider could navigate. The location had been shown to her by her own grandmother, had been used as a refuge during the Civil War, when both armies had swept through these mountains, taking whatever they could find. The shelf contained a cave that provided shelter, a spring that provided water, and access to forests that provided everything else. The climb to the shelf would have challenged a person half her age, required navigation of terrain that seemed impassable, but that concealed routes known only to those who had been shown them. Granny Fugate made the climb carrying supplies that she had accumulated during the months of her campaign, stopped frequently to rest, but never considered turning back. The alternative to reaching the shelf was capture and punishment that would have ended her life in circumstances she found intolerable. The climb, however difficult, was preferable to that alternative. She reached the shelf on the 3rd day of her journey, found the cave that her grandmother had described, discovered that decades of disuse had not diminished its suitability as a refuge. The cave extended approximately 30 feet into the rock face, was high enough to stand in near the entrance, but sloped downward toward the back, remained dry through precipitation that the rock above diverted away from the opening. She built a cabin against the rock face, using techniques that required no tools she could not make and no materials the mountain could not provide. The construction took most of her first year, occupied days that might otherwise have been consumed by grief that her campaign had delayed but not eliminated. The work was harder than anything she had done in years, required strength that she had not known she still possessed, demanded persistence that exceeded what age should have allowed. The cabin was small by any standard, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, a single room that contained everything she needed and nothing that served no purpose. The walls were made of logs that she had cut and shaped herself, each one requiring effort that seemed impossible until it was accomplished. The roof was made of bark and branches, layered to shed water that might otherwise have penetrated. The floor was packed earth, covered with pine needles that provided insulation and a softness that bare ground would not have offered. She built a fireplace from stones that she carried from the creek below, created a chimney that vented smoke through cracks in the rock face rather than through the roof. The design required multiple attempts before she achieved a configuration that drew properly, that allowed fires to burn without filling the cabin with smoke that would have made habitation impossible. The garden she established occupied a small clearing below the shelf, a space where sunlight reached the ground for most of the day, and where soil had accumulated over centuries of leaf fall. She carried seeds that she had saved from her family's garden, planted varieties that her mother had cultivated and that her grandmother had cultivated before that. The first garden produced poorly, the soil less fertile than she had hoped, and the season shorter than the plants required. Subsequent years produced better results, as she learned the specific conditions that her location demanded. The years accumulated with rhythms that the seasons provided. She gathered plants during spring and summer, preserved them for use during winter months when nothing grew. She learned which plants the mountain provided that she had not known before, expanded her knowledge through experimentation that her isolation permitted. Some experiments failed, produced illness that she treated with other plants whose properties she knew well. Other experiments succeeded, revealed capabilities that she added to the knowledge she would eventually document in journals. She trapped small game that provided protein she could not obtain from plants alone. Rabbits and squirrels were her primary quarry, animals that she could capture using snares that required only materials the forest provided. She learned the paths that these animals favored, positioned her traps accordingly, checked them daily during seasons when they were active. The meat she obtained was preserved through drying and smoking, provided sustenance through winters when fresh food was not available. The first winter in her refuge nearly killed her. The cold penetrated even the cave, found gaps in the cabin that she had not known existed, demonstrated that survival in this location would require improvements that the first year's construction had not provided. She survived through determination that refused to accept alternatives, through techniques that her grandmother had taught her for retaining heat when fuel was scarce, through sheer stubbornness that had characterized her throughout a life that had included more than its share of hardships. Each subsequent winter found her better prepared, taught her lessons that accumulated into knowledge that made survival progressively more reliable. She learned to stockpile fuel during months when gathering was possible. She learned to seal gaps that cold air could penetrate. She learned to position herself and her fire for maximum heat retention during the coldest nights. By her fifth winter in the refuge, survival had become routine rather than desperate, a challenge that her preparations were adequate to meet. The isolation should have killed her. The conditions should have been impossible for someone who was 73 when her isolation began, and who reached ages that most people never approached as her isolation continued. But Granny Fugate possessed something that exceeded physical capability, a determination that refused to accept the limitations that age supposedly imposed. She had watched 7 members of her family die because men with badges had stolen their food. She had killed 20 men in response, had achieved vengeance that the legal system would never have provided. She had earned the right to die on her own terms, in a place of her choosing, at a time that she determined rather than one that circumstance imposed. That determination sustained her through years that became decades, through aging that continued, but that could not defeat the will that drove her. The physical changes that age produced were undeniable, but were not sufficient to end her existence. Her hair, which had been white when her isolation began, remained white but thinned, until her scalp was visible beneath strands that no longer provided coverage. Her eyes, which had always been sharp, grew progressively dimmer until she could see only shapes rather than details at distances that once would have been trivial. Her hands, which had been strong enough to build a cabin, grew gnarled and stiff until tasks that once had been routine became challenges that required hours to complete. But she adapted. She developed techniques that accommodated limitations that age imposed, found new ways to accomplish tasks that old ways could no longer complete. She moved more slowly but still moved. She saw less clearly but still saw enough. She maintained existence through adaptations that her intelligence devised and that her determination implemented. She kept journals throughout her isolation, documented her days and thoughts in notebooks she made from materials the wilderness provided. The journals served multiple purposes. They provided activity that filled hours that might otherwise have been empty. They created records that would eventually explain what had happened and why. and they maintained connections to language and thought that pure solitude might otherwise have eroded. She wrote about the family members who had died during the winter of starvation, preserved their memories through descriptions that exceeded what photographs could have captured. She wrote about each child, each grandchild, each great-grandchild whose life had been taken by the seizure that Crawford had orchestrated. She created memorials in words that would outlast the bodies that had been buried in frozen ground. "They killed 7 of my family," she wrote in an entry from 1950, 12 years into her isolation. "They stole our food and left us to starve through a winter that showed no mercy. I watched children die because men with badges took the provisions that would have kept them alive. I held grandchildren whose bodies grew cold because there was nothing left to feed them. Crawford and his deputies called it law enforcement. I called it murder, and I answered it as murder deserved to be answered." She wrote about the killings with precision that would eventually provide answers to questions that investigators had abandoned. Each death was documented, each method was explained, each compound was identified with botanical accuracy that demonstrated the depth of her knowledge. The journals were a confession that she intended to survive her, a truth that she believed the world should eventually know. "I killed 20 men," she wrote. "I killed them with plants that my grandmother taught me to recognize, with compounds that no physician would detect because no physician would think to look for them. I killed them because they murdered my family through starvation and called it taxation. I killed them because justice was not available through any other means. I do not regret what I did. I would do it again, would do it 1,000 times if 1,000 times were required." She wrote about the isolation, about the challenges of maintaining existence when age was constantly reducing the capabilities that survival required. She documented the adaptations she developed, the techniques she refined, the strategies that allowed her to continue living when every circumstance suggested that continuation was impossible. "I am 90 years old today," she wrote in an entry from 1955. "I have lived alone in this cave for 17 years. My body fails me in ways that increase with each passing season. I cannot walk as far as I once could, cannot see as clearly, cannot perform tasks that were once effortless. But I am still alive. The men who killed my family are dead, and I am still alive. That is a victory that nothing can diminish." The decades passed with rhythms that had become familiar. She watched the world change from vantage points that allowed observation without detection. She saw aircraft become common in skies that had been empty when her isolation began. She heard the sounds of machinery that penetrated even her remote location. She observed evidence that the world was transforming in ways she could not participate in, but that she noted in journals that documented everything she saw. The surviving members of the Fugate family believed that Granny had died within months of her disappearance, had held a memorial service in 1940 when a year had passed without any indication that she was still alive. They mourned her as they mourned the other family members who had died during the winter of starvation, added her name to the cemetery where the others were buried, moved forward with lives that her absence had reshaped but not destroyed. They did not know that she was watching them from ridges that overlooked the hollow where the family property was located. She could not visit without risking capture that her crimes would have justified, could not make contact without endangering relatives who might be prosecuted as accessories. But she could observe, could watch from distances that prevented detection, could maintain connection that was one-directional, but that sustained her through decades when other connections were impossible. She watched grandchildren grow into adults and have children of their own. She watched great-grandchildren become parents, watched generations accumulate below her while she remained alone above. She observed births and deaths and weddings and funerals, participated in family events through observation that no one suspected was occurring. The family prospered, despite everything that Crawford's seizure had attempted to accomplish. The survivors rebuilt what had been taken, reclaimed property that had been seized when courts finally recognized the fraud that had produced the assessments. New generations replaced those that the starvation had claimed, filled the hollow with life that the winter of death had seemed to end permanently. Granny Fugate was found on September 15, 1973, exactly 35 years and 3 months after the seizure that had started everything. She was 108 years old, had survived alone in the wilderness for more than 3 decades, had maintained existence through capabilities that exceeded what anyone would have believed possible. The discovery came about almost by accident. Hikers exploring Pine Mountain had wandered off marked trails, had climbed ridges that most people found inaccessible, had stumbled upon the shelf where Granny Fugate had made her home. They found the cabin she had built, found the evidence of decades of solitary habitation, found the elderly woman sitting in a chair outside her door, watching the valley below with eyes that age had dimmed but not extinguished. She was alive when they found her, was conscious and coherent, despite an age that should have made such condition impossible. She spoke to the hikers who had discovered her, explained who she was and why she was there, revealed the truth that 35 years of isolation had preserved. "I killed 20 men," she told them, her voice carrying clarity that her age seemed to contradict. "I killed them because they murdered my family through starvation. I came up here to wait for death, but death has been slow in arriving. I'm ready now. I've been ready for years. I was just waiting for someone to find me, so the truth could be known." The authorities were summoned, found circumstances that exceeded anything they had prepared for. The case files on the deputy deaths had been closed for decades, were so old that most of the officials who had investigated them were themselves dead. The confession that Granny Fugate provided matched evidence that had been gathered 35 years before, solved mysteries that had been abandoned when the solutions seemed impossible. She was not prosecuted. The deaths had occurred 35 years earlier. The evidence had deteriorated beyond any possibility of conviction, and the defendant was 108 years old, with a life expectancy measured in days rather than years. The prosecutor who reviewed the case concluded that prosecution would serve no purpose except to demonstrate cruelty that the legal system should not display. The journals were recovered from her cabin, dozens of handmade notebooks that documented 35 years of survival, and that contained confessions to 20 killings that matched the official records of deaths that had been attributed to natural causes. The investigators who examined these materials found answers to questions that had baffled authorities for more than 3 decades. The revelation produced headlines across the country. The story combined elements that fascinated the public: elderly vengeance, impossible survival, poisoning undetectable even by modern methods, and a woman who had outlived every expectation while waiting for discovery that finally came. Investigators who examined the historical records discovered evidence that supported Granny Fugate's account of what had been done to her family. Documents were found that confirmed Crawford's assessment scheme, that confirmed the seizure had been fraudulent, that the deaths of 7 family members had resulted directly from the theft of food and supplies that the assessment had supposedly justified. The corruption that had murdered her family was exposed alongside the vengeance it had provoked. The descendants of the deputies learned that their ancestors had participated in a scheme that had starved 7 people to death, including 3 children under the age of 5, and that an elderly woman had spent years systematically killing everyone involved, using methods that no investigation had been capable of detecting. Some families had suspected something like this, had preserved stories that hinted at shame rather than mere misfortune. Others had believed the deaths had been natural, had never imagined that the kindly grandmother who had brought pies and preserves had been delivering death with each gift. Granny Fugate lived for 3 more weeks after her discovery, long enough to provide detailed interviews that documented both her crimes and the crimes that had provoked them. She died on October 6, 1973, at the age of 108, the oldest person in Kentucky when she passed, and the oldest killer in Appalachian history. She was buried beside the family members whose deaths she had avenged in the cemetery that had received Fugates since 1805. Her grave bears an inscription that her descendants considered appropriate given everything she had done and everything that had been done to her. Delilah May Fugate, 1865-1973. They starved her family. She remembered. She answered. She waited 35 years. The songs that emerged from the Granny Fugate story were among the most unusual in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of starvation and the patience of an elderly woman who had killed 20 men with methods that seemed more like hospitality than murder. The first verse described the Fugate family before the seizure, the generations that had accumulated property that the assessment would steal, the children and grandchildren whose lives depended on food that would be taken. The melody was warm and secure, suggesting stability that should have been allowed to continue. The second verse described the seizure and the winter that followed, the 7 deaths that occurred because men with badges had stolen provisions that survival required. The melody became something terrible, notes carrying weight that seemed impossible for music to bear, suggesting cold and hunger, and death that came slowly to the weakest first. The third verse described Granny's transformation, the elderly woman who became something else when spring finally came, and she understood that justice would never arrive through any channel except the one she would create. The melody grew quiet and purposeful, suggesting patience that would outlast any obstacle. The fourth verse described the campaign, the 20 deputies who died over months from gifts that seemed to express gratitude, but that contained death refined from plants whose properties only Granny understood. The melody was almost gentle, suggesting hospitality that concealed purposes that no recipient suspected. The fifth verse described the 35 years of hiding, the elderly woman who became a ghost on Pine Mountain, outliving every expectation while waiting for discovery that came when she was older than anyone had thought possible. The melody softened further, became almost peaceful, suggesting existence that had found meaning in survival, that proved something the world needed to understand. The final verse described the discovery and the confession, the truth that emerged from a woman who was 108 years old and who had waited 35 years for someone to find her and hear what she needed to say. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that patience, however extreme, eventually receives its reward. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves where Granny Fugate rests among the family members whose deaths she avenged? To read the inscription that promises she remembered and she answered? Would you climb Pine Mountain to see the shelf where she survived for 35 years? Would you try to understand how determination could sustain life that age should have ended decades before? The journey to Leslie County is easier now than it was in 1937. The roads paved and the world more connected than it was when deputies seized food from a family that would starve without it. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of grandmothers rest in those mountains, and the stories of what was done and what was done in response echo still through hollows that have witnessed both injustice and its answer. And that, my friend, is the true story of the granny who vanished for 35 years and was found on a mountain after poisoning 20 lawmen who starved her family. A story of love that became fury, that became decades of solitude, that ended only when discovery brought truth that the world needed to hear. The mountains remember, and through them so do we all. So there you go, my friend. Now you know the rest of the story. Granny Fugate killed 20 deputies who had participated in a seizure that starved 7 members of her family to death, then survived alone on a mountain for 35 years until hikers stumbled upon her cabin and found her still alive at 108 years old. What about you? If deputies stole your family's food and you watched children starve to death during a winter that showed no mercy, what would you do? Could you kill 20 men with hospitality that no one would suspect? Could you survive alone on a mountain for 35 years, waiting for discovery that would allow the truth to finally be known? The mountains don't answer such questions. They simply endure, keeping their secrets and their dead. And some grandmothers love their families so completely that they will wait 35 years for the chance to explain what they did and why they did it. Thanks for listening to this story. And as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the grannies who call them home.